Yo, what's up everybody? Welcome back to the channel. Today we're going to talk about something that I think everyone should know how to do in 2021, even if you're not a photographer, and that's the absolute basics of photography. At one point or another, you've probably picked up someone's DSLR and gone, hey, I have no idea what these numbers mean. I don't know how to use this. So today we're going to fix that. Today we're going to learn about camera basics. So, at one point or another, people have owned a camera that's not the one on the back of their phones. While iPhone cameras are great, they realistically can't compete with DSLR or mirrorless cameras. Now, the major drawback of those cameras is that they have tons of modes. If you buy a Canon camera, you're gonna have P, which is the automatic mode. You're gonna have shutter priority, aperture priority, full manual, and that can get overwhelming super quickly. So people just end up defaulting and using the automatic mode. It's the easiest one to use, it does all of the settings for you, and it takes great pictures. So logically, it's the right choice if you don't know what you're doing. Now, while automatic mode is super intelligent, it's not always right. And unless you're in full manual mode, you're not gonna be using your camera to its fullest capabilities. So today, we're gonna learn how to shoot in full manual. And hey, if you buy a $1,000 camera, you probably want to know how to use it. Now, this information is also going to apply to any other camera equipment like drones, GoPros, really anything where you have any manual control over the camera. Now, stick with me guys, because we're going to break it down now. So basically what you're controlling in full manual mode is the exposure, or in other words, the brightness of your image. Now, this brightness is controlled by 3 levers or mechanics or whatever you want to call them. And these 3 mechanics are known as shutter speed, aperture, and ISO. And a little pro tip, that's the order you want to set them in. So let's go ahead and start off with shutter speed. So shutter speed is the easiest to understand out of the 3. Shutter speed is basically how long your camera shutter is open for until it snaps the picture that you're trying to take. Now, you can take an image at a faster shutter speed or a slower shutter speed. So first off, let's take a look at an example of an image that was taken at a faster shutter speed. So this image was taken at 1/400th of a second. I was waving around this Nintendo Switch controller, but you'd never be able to tell. And that's because the shutter speed was so fast that everything is still crisp. So what a fast shutter speed does is try to eliminate motion as much as possible. Essentially, you're trying to freeze items in place. Now, a fast shutter speed is great for moving objects like animals or anything like that you want to get a really crisp image of. Now, let's take a look at the opposite and take a look at an image that was taken at a slower shutter speed. This image was taken at a 1-second shutter speed, which is very slow. The shutter was open for a whole second, and as you can see, this time my hand is extremely blurry. And that's because everything that I did within that 1 second was captured by the camera. Now, you might be asking, why would you ever use a slow shutter speed? Now, personally, I don't. But the longer the shutter is open for, the more light it lets in. A slower shutter speed can help you in lower light conditions where things are darker and really help to brighten up the image. With slower shutter speeds, you can also do long exposure photography or astrophotography, but those are a little bit more complicated, and this is camera basics. So we'll save that stuff for another day. So let's recap real quick. A faster shutter speed equals crisper images, but less light getting into the sensor, which results in darker images. A slower shutter speed will result in blurrier images, but it allows more light to get into the sensor, so your images will be brighter. Now that we understand shutter speed, let's move on to aperture. Now, of the 3 exposure settings, aperture is my personal favorite, and I personally think that it's the most useful. The biggest advantage of having a DSLR or a mirrorless camera is that the camera is able to understand depth of field. And what that means is that it understands where things are relative to each other in space. So to give you an example, it knows that those lights over there are behind me, and an iPhone is not really capable of doing that. Now, why is any of that important? We're going to talk about that once we start to understand what aperture is. So let's dive into an image as an example right away. This image was taken at f4.0. Now, aperture is measured in f-stops. So f4.0 is considered to be a lower f-stop, which is a fast aperture. Okay, I know that's a little confusing, but stick with me. The lower the number, the faster the aperture. And the faster the aperture, the wider the iris or the eye of the lens is going to open up. And the wider it opens up, the more light it lets in. So at a faster aperture, your images will be brighter. But here's where the magic happens. The faster the aperture, the blurrier things will become that are not your main subject. This blur is known as bokeh or bokeh, however you want to describe it. And this is where you can get creative and take images like this, where the background is super blurry, but your subject is still totally in focus. This was taken at f1.8, so that's an extremely fast aperture. Now, let's look at the opposite again. This image was taken at f11, so a very slow aperture. Now you'll notice the hand in the background is way clearer and way more in focus compared to our previous image. But you'll also notice that it's darker, and that's what a slower aperture will do for you. But now you might be asking, what if we want an image that's brighter, but also where everything is in focus? So if you think back, you'll remember that if we start to lower our shutter speed a little bit, the camera is going to be open for a little bit longer, letting more light in, and that can help brighten up your image. So right away, you can start to see how the different functions, the different mechanics of exposure in manual mode start to work together. Okay, let's recap real quick before we move on. Now, a low f-stop number equals a fast aperture. And a fast aperture is going to let a lot more light into the sensor of the camera, making your images brighter, but it's also going to make everything that's not the subject a little blurry depending on how much bokeh or bokeh your camera is going to apply. A slower aperture speed, so a higher f-stop number, is going to make your images a lot more crisper all around. Everything will be in focus, but it's also going to make the images darker because the eye of the lens is just a little bit smaller and not open as wide as before. Now that we understand aperture, let's move on to ISO. Now, ISO is super easy to understand. ISO basically adjusts the sensitivity of your sensor, and that's just a fancy way of saying it just makes your image brighter. But what it's doing is that it's artificially making it brighter. So let's dive into our examples real quick so we can understand that a little bit better. So this image was taken at 100 ISO, which is generally the lowest ISO for most cameras. And this image was already properly exposed, so there wasn't really much need for ISO here. But if we take a look at another image or another example that was taken at a very high ISO, like 6400 for example, you'll notice the image is extremely bright. But both images were taken in the exact same conditions. Now, ISO is cool, but it has one major drawback. If we zoom in, you'll notice the image is kinda grainy. We call this grain noise. Now, the higher your ISO, the more noise the image will have. So I personally do everything I can to make sure my ISO is as low as possible. If we go back to the 100 ISO image, you'll notice that there's no grain here whatsoever and the image is super clear. And boom, that's it guys. You guys have been officially educated in camera basics. Now, I know that was a lot of information at once and it might sound confusing right now. So feel free to scroll through the video and go back to any parts that might have been a little confusing for you. You can also feel free to drop a comment below or DM me on Instagram if you have any questions. I'm happy to help. Now, one important thing to keep in mind is that these are just the basics of photography. And the magic really lies in understanding how these three functions work together in manual mode to create really special images. And just like anything else in life, it's going to take a little bit of practice, it's going to take a little bit of time, and before you know it, it'll all become second nature. You'll be changing your aperture, you'll be changing your shutter speed, and you'll be changing your ISOs like pros in no time. Now, if you've stuck around until the end, I know that was a really long video, so I really appreciate it. And hopefully you guys learned something new and you really enjoyed that. If you did, please smash that thumbs up button, give this video a like, it really helps the video out. If you guys have enjoyed the content that you've been seeing on my channel and the stuff that I've been producing lately, please subscribe to my channel. That would really mean a lot to me and I would really appreciate it. Other than that, I don't really have anything else for the rest of this video, so I'll see you guys in the next one. Take care of yourselves in the meantime and keep creating.